Welcome to the 7th lecture. This week we'll learn about two belief systems that were being promoted in the late 1800s and early 1900s, William James's functionalism and Titchener's structuralism. Now that we've finished the first two modules, we know more about how psychology was established. For the rest of the semester, we will cover specific perspectives and subfields of psychology, starting with structuralism and functionalism. We'll start by learning more about who Edward Titchener was and how he contributed to psychology. Edward Bradford Titchener was born and raised in England. Eventually, he would become a psychologist and found structuralism. He was raised by his grandfather, who taught him the traditional gentleman's code of the time. This code would eventually impact the field of psychology, including how Titchener interacted with women in the field. As an undergraduate student at Oxford University, he developed an appreciation for the preciseness of the lab, of the laboratory experiments he helped conduct. He mainly participated in physiological experiments, but appreciated the standardization, the structure of the procedures. He would use this standard of preciseness to judge the rest of his peers for the rest of his life. He had very high standards set, and very few colleagues at the time met his standards. He was not well liked in the field of psychology because he was such a stickler for procedure and methods. At the same time, he was promoting something that we try to promote today, which is use the scientific method, follow the rules, follow the procedures, make sure it's standardized, make sure it's objective. In 1892, he earned his PhD from the University of Leipzig. Wilhelm Wundt, the father of psychology, was teaching there at this time, and Oswald Kulpe was also a student at the university. Although Wundt and Titchener had very little contact with one another, Wundt's ideas still rubbed off on Titchener. In the same year he graduated, 1892, he moved from England to the United States to teach at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Remember that 1892 was the year that the APA was established. When he came to Cornell University, he brought Wundt's ideas with him, specifically his method of introspection. In this way, Titchener is a lot like William James. They both brought German psychology to the United States in the 1890s. While at Cornell, he would eventually establish an experimental psychology lab and publish. By 1900, he was a major player in both European psychology and American psychology. Everyone knew who Titchener was in 1900. Although some of us are not familiar with Titchener's work, he was incredibly important to establishing psychology as a scientific field of study. I have 6 of his contributions on the next few slides. Let's jump right in with the first one. He founded structuralism sometime in the 1890s. What he was trying to do was identify the structures, the elements of the mind, structuralism. We'll talk more about structuralism later in the lecture. One of the things that you need to know is that structuralism failed. We don't talk about structuralism today. In fact, this may be the first time you're hearing about it. That's because in the early 1900s, it fell out of favor and was replaced by functionalism, eventually behaviorism, eventually humanism. The figure on the screen came from one of Titchener's earliest books. It is an illustration of the structures of the ear. We know that founders are promoters, and Titchener definitely promoted not only structuralism, but also psychology. I have 4 examples of his earliest books. One of his greatest contributions was his promotion of the scientific method in psychology. After arriving at Cornell University in 1892, he expanded the existing lab. He recruited graduate students. He bought more equipment. He published books and articles. He edited a popular journal. He translated the German texts of Wilhelm Wundt and Oswald Kolbe, who also studied introspection, his preferred method. All three of these individuals, Wundt, Kolbe, and Titchener, used some version of introspection. We'll talk about Titchener's version when we talk about structuralism, but just know that he preferred this method and used it quite a bit to study perception and sensation in the early days. Titchener called his version of introspection experimental self-observation, and he trained his participants to introspect. This is a picture of Titchener's lab at Cornell University. I pulled this image from one of Titchener's articles. Despite Titchener's strongly held gentleman's code, he did promote the careers of several women in psychology. Nearly half, 38%, of his graduate students were women, 21 of 56. His first doctoral student, Margaret Washburn, was the first woman to earn a PhD in psychology, and she did this in 1894. He also urged Cornell University at one point to hire a woman psychologist. Titchener was one of the original members of the American Psychological Association, but over time he became dissatisfied with the group. They had different visions for the field. The APA was going in a more applied direction. Titchener was very focused on the science side of psychology. So they had different visions. Titchener was an outsider because he was born and raised in England and educated in England. He also disagreed with the APA's simplistic approach to research. Again, he had a very high standard, and even the APA as a group did not meet his standard. In 1904, he created his own special group and called them the experimentalists because they were focused on the experimental method. Today, the organization is known as the Society of Experimental Psychologists, and you can see there the established date, 1904. That was the year that Titchener created this group. The members of this group met periodically to discuss their research, new ideas, new trends, new equipment, and they visited each other's labs. But women were not allowed to join the group. This prohibition had more to do with the gentleman's code than it did with his beliefs about women. He knew women were capable of working right alongside him. He had worked with them. He had plenty of graduate students show him that the assumptions about women were false. It's not that he believed the traditional stereotypes. It was his gentleman's code. The gentleman's code says that men cannot drink in front of, smoke cigars in front of, curse in front of, or debate in front of women. Men were not supposed to do these things in front of women. The experimentalists were made up of mostly men, and when they would get together, they would smoke cigars and drink whiskey. That's what they did. He couldn't allow women to attend these meetings because it would violate this code. The final contribution I'd like to mention is his publication of 2 training manuals. In 1901 and 1905, he published 2 volumes of his famous manuals. They were designed to teach undergraduate and graduate students how to conduct psychology experiments. You can look at both volumes in their entirety by clicking on the 2 links. In this figure, you see Titchener's illustration of Wundt's equipment. When psychology was first established in Germany, graduate students learned how to conduct experiments by observing their more experienced peers and asking lots of questions. In the United States, graduate students completed what were called drill courses. They set up the equipment, they conducted replicated former studies, they analyzed the data, they worked with their classmates to alternate between being the experimenter and the participant in the experiment. So American labs became more hands-on at the turn of the century. Titchener saw this trend and published these 2 volumes to serve as a type of training method to assist the American students in their efforts to learn more about the lab. In his volumes, he describes 2 types of studies, qualitative and quantitative. His qualitative studies involved introspection, some type of recounting one's experience with stimuli. Quantitative studies involved numerical data, things like reaction time and sensory thresholds. Despite the fact that these manuals are more than 100 years old, they are still relevant to us today. There's plenty of information on the hundreds of pages in these manuals. There's plenty that is still relevant to us today. He has all kinds of illustrations. He has step-by-step instructions for how to do basic lab procedures. Very interesting. I suggest you check out both of those volumes. Just scroll through them. Now that we know more about the founder of structuralism, let's learn more about what it is and the methods that were used to study the elements of the mind. So we know that Titchener founded structuralism, but what exactly is it? It's the study of the mind's structures, the elements of the mind, and how these elements combine to form complex mental processes and behaviors. Structuralists tended to focus on things like sensation and perception, but their overarching goal was to analyze structures. Titchener said that structural psychology was a lot like anatomy. Anatomy is the study of the body's structures, bones, organs, veins. Structural psychology is the study of the mind's structures, sensations, feelings, and images. He also identified some of the attributes or descriptors of these 3 elements. Sensations, he thought, combined to create perception. Sensation is the basis of perception, according to Titchener. Images combine to form thought, ideas. Feelings combine to form emotions. So according to Titchener, we have 3 basic elements, all of the mental processes, all of the behaviors that we exhibit are based on these 3 elements. Sensations and images share the same attributes. They both can be described using thousands of different qualities, intensities, durations, and they both have variance in terms of their clarity. Different sensations are clearer than others, different images are clearer than others. Affects, feelings have slightly different qualities. We can describe them in terms of their pleasantness or their unpleasantness. We can look at intensity, just like we can look at intensity with the other 2, duration as well, but not in terms of clarity. He reserved clearness for sensations and images. Apparently, emotions do not differ in terms of their clarity. Remember that these are Titchener's ideas, not modern psychology's ideas. Structuralists relied on introspection. Titchener specifically used this method to conduct both his qualitative and his quantitative studies. His method of introspection was more precise than Kolpe's and Wundt's methods. They both had different versions. Titchener's was, of course, more precise because he was drawn to the preciseness of the lab. The main difference between Titchener's method of introspection and the methods of the other 2 is that Titchener trained his participants. Before they were ever allowed to participate in this study, they had to undergo a training program. They had to learn how to introspect according to Titchener's standards. After training, he would present different types of stimuli and record how they responded. He might show them a pin, for example, and ask them to describe the experience of perceiving this pin. They could use any word on the planet except for the word pen. Most of us probably would not describe feelings when it comes to pens. Most of us don't have feelings, but we might describe sensations and we might describe images of the pen. Emotions, probably not, unless you really love pens. I do really love a good gel pen, so I might describe happiness. Can we experience something and describe it accurately at the same time? Experience, describe. Can you look at something and verbally explain what you're seeing, the sensations, the images, the feelings? Some people really struggled to do this. Some of his participants were not good at it. So he developed a training program, trained them how to introspect. In order to combat their struggles, he had 3 strategies that he taught all of his participants to use, all of his observers to use. 1, he taught them how to remember the different attributes: quality, duration, intensity, clarity. 2, he taught them how to break the experience into different sections, different stages. He called this fractionation. 3, he taught them how to develop an introspective habit, which was essentially a way of taking notes, taking mental notes while participants experienced the stimuli, and do it without interfering with that experience, with consciousness. These 3 strategies, he said, made introspection more precise, standardized, and objective. Eventually, structuralism is overpowered by functionalism. Let's learn a little bit more about it and how it developed. At about the same time that structural psychology was becoming the dominant force in psychology, functionalism also emerged. William James is responsible for establishing and promoting this school of thought, although he would have never considered himself to be a functionalist. This is because the ideas came first, the name came later. Functionalists are concerned about the function, the purpose of different mental processes and behaviors. They want to understand why we have these processes, why we have these behaviors. Do they somehow help us adapt to our environment? What is the purpose of them? Between the 1890s and the 1920s, functionalism was popular in the United States, partly because many of the psychologists at the time wanted a new scientific type of psychology. So it fit right in with the zeitgeist, the mood of the times. This perspective was inspired by Darwin's theory of natural selection, his ideas about how animals evolved over time to better fit their environment led some functionalists, some psychologists to wonder how the human, in terms of its psychology, how the human might have also adapted over time, evolved over time to better suit the environment. William James was interested in habits. He wanted to know why humans are creatures of habits. Do habits help us survive? Do they help us learn? Do they help us get along with other people? What's the function of habits? The other important thing to know about functionalism is that it rejected introspection. Anyone who ascribed to the functional psychology ideas did not use introspection. It was essentially forbidden in this approach. This is one of the reasons why structuralism eventually dies and functionalism takes over. Introspection is subjective. Although Wundt, Kolbe, and Titchener would not have admitted it, when we compare it to the studies we conduct today, introspection is a more subjective method. Psychologists, despite Wundt, Kolbe, and Titchener's pleading, psychologists at the time wanted something even more scientific than what it had claimed to be in the initial stages in the 1890s. So in the 1910s, 1920s, especially after World War I, we start to see American psychologists really crave a more objective way of studying humans, not asking them to describe their experiences, but collecting numbers, collecting data in some way. In the early part of the 20th century, structural psychology and functional psychology were competing for psychologists' attention. Eventually, structuralism fails and functionalism wins. It becomes psychology as we know it today. It is the ancestor of the different subfields that we enjoy studying today. Things like IO psychology, my favorite, clinical psychology, educational psychology, behaviorism, which comes in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Functionalism is the nest within which our favorite types of psychology were hatched. Functionalism spread through these relationships. The study of the function of the mind started really with Darwin. He inspired the ideas, and then those ideas spread decade after decade after decade from professor to student. Once the students graduated and went on to their own positions as tenured professors, they then shared those ideas with their students. And the process continued, and the ideas spread throughout the United States rather quickly. Between the mid 1800s and the late 1800s, the United States expanded its transportation infrastructure. It built roads, it built railroads. It also expanded its communities. Buildings were constructed, manufacturing units were constructed. And on top of all of this, there were many, many inventions being created at the time. I have a few examples here at the bottom of the screen. American football, the electric typewriter, the telephone, tattoo machines, skyscrapers, the motion picture, gasoline-powered tractors. All of these things were invented at this time, and the purpose was really all about making life better, easier, and that competition, let's win, let's do more, let's become the greatest power on the planet. American values also fit with social Darwinism, which was popular at the time. It was created by Herbert Spencer. He's the one who created the term survival of the fittest. It was not Darwin. Spencer said that the fittest are those who win fierce battles for important resources. The fittest are those who win, who compete and win. And the fittest will rise to the top of society on their own. Darwin didn't use the word fittest. He said that the animals who survive are those who are the best adapted for their environment. It might mean strength, but sometimes the animal that has the best camouflage, the best reflexes, the best mating call, those are the animals that survive and reproduce. Social Darwinism was a twist on Darwin's initial theory of evolution. This idea about competing and rising to the top through hard work, this idea aligned with American values at the time. It also tied functionalism to American values. This evolutionary mindset led to the study of individual differences and the function of these differences. From there, we studied animals, human development, and even abnormal behavior. We also began to apply psychology to the workplace, to educational settings, to everyday problems faced by millions of Americans. Functionalists asked all kinds of questions, but I have a couple of examples at the bottom of the screen. Why do we laugh? Why do we help each other? What is the purpose of pro-social behavior? Why do we feel jealous? Why are these things part of the human experience? What function do they serve? So we know that functionalism spread from professor to student. So we know that functionalism spread, one, because professors passed the ideas on to their students, two, because it aligned with Americans' values in the early 1900s. The third reason is because there were several people who promoted it, who promoted the ideas. Chauncey Wright promoted evolutionary theory from the moment he read Darwin's book in 1859 up until 1875 when he passed away. If it hadn't been for his early death, he probably would have spent the remaining years promoting evolutionary thinking. At Darwin's request, Wright wrote an article about the function of the purpose of consciousness. Wright argued that the function of consciousness is to help us control our behaviors. He believed that animals are driven more by instincts and their animal mind, but humans must have evolved over time so that humans have free will, have choice in how they behave. In 1872, a few years before he died, he helped establish the Metaphysical Club in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There were many early psychologists who were part of this group, who attended some of its meetings. They often met in his house, and William James helped him do this. James helped Wright because he shared similar ideas. He had similar beliefs about the theory of natural selection. Remember, James had traveled to other countries and observed his own evidence of evolution. James promoted Wright's ideas even after his death in 1875. James specifically said that the mind has adapted to help us make better decisions, not only have more control over our behaviors, more control over our decisions, but actually to make those decisions and those behaviors better, more impactful, more useful to us. From James's early work in the 1890s, functionalism was born. In the last section of this lecture, we're going to cover some of the other functionalists who promoted these ideas. In the early 1900s, functionalism was extremely popular in the United States. It was prominent at two universities, the University of Chicago and Columbia University. We will cover these four individuals, but there are plenty more examples in the chapter if you're interested. First, we'll start with the University of Chicago, John Dewey and James Angell. John Dewey was an American psychologist, and his work was influential in social reform and in the field of education. In 1884, he earned his PhD from Johns Hopkins University under the direction of G. Stanley Hall and a few others like Pierce. That same year, he accepted a faculty position at the University of Michigan and taught there until 1894. He was then recruited to chair the philosophy department at the University of Chicago. The university had just opened with a $1 million donation from John D. Rockefeller and the Baptist Church. One of his first tasks was to recruit other functionalists, other people who shared his similar ideas. He established the University of Chicago as a center of functionalism by doing this. In 1896, he published an article that helped promote functionalism as well as the University of Chicago. Before Dewey, before he published this article, many people thought that sensation, perception, and response to stimuli happened in stages, one at a time. Dewey suggested that all of these things happen at the same time. Seeing, touching, hearing, tasting happen at the same time, and we respond at the same time. I'm watching the camera and responding at the same time. My brain has adapted to allow me to talk to you and look at you or the screen at the same time. Why? To help me adapt, to help me survive, to help me adjust to a changing environment. In 1899, he served as the 8th APA president. And remember, you have to be special, you have to contribute to psychology in order to earn this accolade. He mentored the next person we'll talk about, James Angel, and passed his functionalist ideas along to all of his graduate students. James Roland Angel has an interesting biography. He was born into a very academic family. His father was a university president twice. His grandfather was a professor and university president. His brother was a professor and federal judge. His brother-in-law was a chair of a history department, and one of his cousins established 2 psychology labs at about the same time that he was active. In 1891, he earned his master's degree from the University of Michigan, where he studied with John Dewey before Dewey went to the University of Chicago. Angel earned a second master's degree from Harvard University in 1892, the next year. He studied with Hermann Ebbinghaus in Berlin, but he never finished his dissertation. In 1895, Angel follows Dewey to the University of Chicago. They researched together, they wrote books together, they formed a partnership based on their functionalist ideas. In 1905, Angel took over Dewey's position at the University of Chicago, and Dewey left for Columbia University. While Angel was the chair, he helped promote functionalism, psychology, and the experimental method. He did this by studying reaction times, imagery, and sound localization. His main goal was to identify the situations in which certain reactions happened. In 1904, he published a popular textbook. It has both structure and function in the title. That's because both were popular in the first 10 years of the 20th century. In 1906, Angel became the 15th president of the APA, and he mentored John B. Watson, the father of behaviorism, and we'll learn about Watson in a few weeks. Dewey and Angel promoted functionalism at the University of Chicago. Now let's turn our attention to Cattell and Thorndike at Columbia University. James M. Cattell was an American psychologist who worked really hard to promote psychology as a legitimate science, like biology or physics. In 1886, he earned his PhD from the University of Leipzig while working with Wilhelm Wundt. Together, he and Wundt began the formal study of intelligence. In 1889, he returned to the United States to teach at the University of Pennsylvania. He was actually born in Pennsylvania, so he was going home. He coined the term mental test in an article he published in 1890. He had administered a test battery of 10 tests to some of the students at the University of Pennsylvania. He asked them questions about their sensations, just noticeable difference, reaction time, rate of movement. He used a test that was very similar to Francis Galton's test to study individual differences in this small sample of students. In 1891, he transferred to Columbia University to chair the psychology department. While he was there, he tested incoming freshmen using the same battery he had used on the students at the University of Pennsylvania. He compared their results to their grades, to their academic performance. He predicted that his test results would be correlated with their grades. and they weren't. One of his students, Clark Whistler, failed to find any correlations between his tests and academic performance. But that's okay, because these mental tests and the statistical analyses that they used to assess correlations inspired hundreds of other researchers to do the same. And mental testing was born. He served as the fourth APA president in 1895. Flash forward a few decades and World War I begins. He opposed the war, and Columbia University fired him in 1917 for some of the things that he was saying about the war. He sued the university and won, used the money to establish the Psychological Corporation in 1921. His firing led many universities in the United States to establish what we call tenure, to protect professors' sometimes unpopular beliefs. Under the tenure model, professors cannot be fired just because they don't agree with the university or they don't agree with popular opinion. In addition to helping establish mental testing and applied psychology, he also mentored Edward L. Thorndike, who we will talk about next. Edward Lee Thorndike was an American psychologist who contributed to comparative psychology and educational psychology. In 1897, he earned his master's degree from Harvard University, where he studied with William James. In 1898, he earned his PhD from Columbia University, where he studied with Cattell. He also worked with several applied psychologists to create the Army Alpha and Army Beta tests in World War I. These tests are known today as the ASVAB. They're used to classify recruits and place them in jobs that are best suited for their talents. In 1899, he accepted a teaching position at Columbia University, where he would remain for his entire career. While he was there, he expanded his animal research to include a variety of different species, including the ones you see on this screen: primates, birds, cats, dogs, and yes, even fish. He did observe fish to try to better understand how a fish operates in its environment. He was famous for his animal studies because his work paved the way for others, but also set the standard. He had a number of different strategies that he urged researchers to use. Make sure you study more than one animal and study more than one species. Repeat the same experiment with the same animals. And finally, make sure that you document and control the learning environment. Make sure that within one experiment, all of the animals are tested in the same environment. If you test them in two different rooms, in two different boxes, that is considered a weakness of your study. So many of the standards that we know today were being promoted by Thorndike. Today, we know that behavior is affected by its consequences, but Thorndike was one of the first individuals to study this connection. In his most famous studies, he recorded cats as they tried to escape from these puzzle boxes he had built. He looked at the actions they took, the order in which they took the actions, and how long it took them between actions and how long it took them to escape from the box. There were different variations of these puzzle boxes, but they all had a latch that had to be moved in order to open the door. Here's an example on the screen of one of his puzzle boxes. You can see he places some motivator, some reinforcer outside of the cage to encourage the cat to escape. The cat tries all types of behaviors. When it hits the latch, the door opens, the cat receives the reward. This chart shows us how long it took the cat to escape on each trial. You can see as the cat experiences more trials, the time it takes to escape decreases. The cat learns somehow how to escape from these puzzle boxes. In the first 20 trials, the cat moves around in the box and accidentally hits the latch. That's how it escapes. In the next 20 trials, the cat avoids the things that don't work. Eventually, the cats, when placed in the box, go right to the latch, move it, and escape. It doesn't take very long for them to escape. Based on his puzzle box studies and his observations of the cat's behavior, he drew a few conclusions about learning. Learning occurs gradually and incrementally. It happens slowly over time, and it happens in sort of stages that build on one another. Learning also occurs through prior experience, but also through trial and accidental success. Trying different things and figuring out that some of those things we try actually work. So we keep doing those things and we stop doing the things that don't work. He also found that learning can be transferred from one situation to the next. When he took a cat that had learned to escape from one puzzle box and put it in a different puzzle box, that cat could escape faster than a cat who was brand new to the experiment. That cat had learned and remembered how to escape from the previous box, applied that learning to a new situation, a new box. Based on his studies, he created two laws of animal behavior, the law of effect and the law of exercise. Both of these laws attempt to explain the connection between stimuli and responses. These laws formed the basis for B.F. Skinner's reinforcement theory that would come years later. The law of effect says that responses that work will strengthen the connection. Responses that don't work will not strengthen the connection, and in some cases, weaken it. Over several trials, the cat's successful behaviors were stamped in, and their unsuccessful behaviors were stamped out. The law of exercise says that the connection strengthens with practice. The more we practice, the stronger the connection. Later in life, he retracted this idea, the law of exercise, because practice alone isn't enough to make this connection stronger. As proof of his influence on psychology, he was elected the 21st APA president in 1912. I have just one more slide that I want to cover briefly to summarize the differences between functionalism and structuralism. Structuralism was founded by Titchener. Functionalism was founded by James. Structuralists studied the elements of the mind. Functionalists studied the purpose of mental processes and behavior. Structuralism was promoted by a few in the late 1890s and early 1900s. Functionalism was promoted by many during this time. And finally, structuralism failed to impact modern psychology in any significant way other than promoting science as an important method in the field. Functionalism is the nest, remember that image, it's the nest in which modern psychology was hatched. All of our subfields developed from functionalism. Now that you know more about functionalism and Cattell and Thorndike, we can turn our attention to the development of mental testing and applied psychology next week in the Week 8 lecture. Thanks for joining me today, and I will see you next week.